and welcome to episode 8 of Stitched in Sweden. I'm Maria, your host, and you can find me on Ravelry and Instagram as mmonska. You can find our Ravelry group by searching Stitched in Sweden, and the show notes are at stitchedinsweden.blogspot.com. So, welcome to the show. This week I will be talking about this week in Stockholm, my works in progress, a couple of finished objects, some upcoming plans, as well as a new question and answer section. So, first I just wanted to say a big thank you to those of you who have participated this week in answering the question from last week, which was, what is your most worn or used finished object? And there were a lot of fun responses there, and it was cool to see some of your projects as well. And some people mentioned items that other people who they had knit for, like things that they wear and use. And then I was thinking about it, and I think that maybe, well, it's probably similarly worn, but the Timberline sweater that I knit for Thomas, which is a big cabley man sweater, I made mine out of Cascade 220 in, I think it's called Silver Fox, maybe? Or maybe it's just Silver Gray. And he wears that all the time. So, when it's cold enough, which in the winter it usually is. So that might be an actual contender for the most worn finished objects, but my most worn finished object was my hat from last week. So, yeah, we'll talk about a little bit more about the question and answer in the end of the podcast. So first I just wanted to start out with this week in Stockholm. It's been another lovely spring feeling week. The sun has been out almost every single day. You see lots of little birds flying around. I haven't noticed very many buds on any plants yet, but I'm sure that's coming soon. So it's definitely, to me, it's starting to feel more like shawl knitting weather, lace tops, that kind of thing. So a lot of my planning for new projects has been with that in mind. But you will see when I show you what I've been working on, which I can show you right now. So I talked to you a little bit last week about how I wanted to make a lightweight top with, I was thinking about the Water Lily, which has mostly a stockinette body up to like here, and then it has a top lace part with it's kind of like a v-neck. And I was thinking about that pattern, and I thought I would give something like that a try. So I started doing some swatching. This is going to be on this blue yarn, which I showed you last week, which is from Magazine Duet, and it's their Super Soft. It's a pretty fine yarn. So this swatch has already been washed, so it plumped up quite a bit. But I'll show you on the other unwashed yarn. There's quite a big difference in the diameter. So that's unwashed, and that's washed. So maybe you can't tell that much, but the washed one is a lot fluffier, so it kind of poofs out a bit, which is nice because, for example, in these stockinette sections, like at this stockinette section here, when I first knit it, it was pretty holey, and I want it to be nice and lightweight, so I don't really want a dense fabric because it's going to be a summer top, but I also don't want it to be see-through or too loose. but I was really happy with how it blocked because now it's a good, you can't see directly through it, but I can see light from my side looking through, but it's not too loose. I think it's a good fabric that I ended up with. So this is my swatch. I tested out 2 different lace designs. This lower one is the one I decided to go with. And maybe you can see it a little better there. And that's the upper one, which maybe I'll use some other time on a sock pattern or something like that. But I wanted it to be a little bit more open for the top part. So I have cast on for that sweater just a little bit. I've just knit a little bit. But I am knitting this on my 3mm US 2.5 carbons, which I got I talked about last week. And this is all I have. So maybe 2 inches, 2.5 inches or so. And this is just the front of the cardigan. So I did it's not a cardigan. This is just the front of the top. So I did just a little garter stitch edge here, and then I'm working some decreases to do some shaping, and I will seam them. I'll knit it back also, obviously, and then I will seam them together. I don't mind seaming. Ever since seaming together the Timberline sweater for Thomas, which gave very specific directions for how to do the seaming, I don't mind it as much because that one turned out so well. So what I do now is do a garter stitch selvage. So that means that one stitch on the edge is in garter stitch, whereas this part is in stockinette. And that leaves the little bumps there. And I had done that before, and then when I went to sew it together, it looked horrible because I was trying to sew bump to bump. But what you have to do is actually pick up the thread in between the bump stitch and the next stockinette stitch and stitch those together, so you end up with all of the bumps on the inside of the fabric. So I just found, I can try to link the video or tutorial or something that I've used for that, but I found it to be fairly easy to do once I had a really methodical way to do it, because before I was just kind of guessing of where to put the seam, and it never came out neatly. But now it's just easy, and of course knitting garments flat adds some stability to them in terms of having seams. It adds some structure to your garments. But another reason that I like to knit things flat is that your pieces that you're working with are a lot smaller. So right now I have 100-something stitches, but close to around 100 stitches on my needles. And if I was knitting it in the round, then I would have double that. And if I make a mistake, I'm ripping out 200 stitches, however many rows down I have to do to fix the mistake, as opposed to only 100 stitches. So yes, you have to purl also, which many people don't like, but another benefit is that, this is a weird benefit, but if you knit your sweater or garment, whatever, in pieces, then you don't have to knit your swatch in the round. And I know there's easier ways that you can knit your swatch in the round, but then if you need to rip your swatch out because you ran out of yarn or something, and you've done that thing where you carry the yarn behind and then you snip up all the back, well, you just lost all that yarn. So I prefer knitting some garments flat. That doesn't mean that I'm always going to knit them flat, but yeah. This one is a very fine yarn. I think it's closer to a lace weight. So when you have that many stitches on the needles, I think it's nice to do it flat. We'll see if I change my mind later farther along in the project. Another thing that I've been working on this week is a new sock pattern, which I will be releasing probably in a couple weeks as a free pattern on Ravelry. And I am knitting this. I'm not going to show you the actual pattern, it's on the other side, but this is the bottom of the foot. I'm knitting this in the yarn that I showed you that I bought last week. And I have half of it here, the other half of it is here. It's knitting up really nicely. I plan on these to be some sort of house socks, just because of the yarn is a little bit thicker than fingering weight, but the pattern will be written for fingering weight. I'm going to knit a different pair as well. But I'm planning on these to be house socks kind of in the spring transition time where maybe my slippers are too warm, but I still need something on my feet walking around on our wood floors. So that is going along nicely, and I've got a couple people knitting that as well, so that pattern should be out in a couple weeks. This week I did finish 2 projects, and one of them is the Clara dress, and if you would like to know more about this dress, you can look at the show notes for previous episodes or this episode where I have the links about why it's a controversial pattern, who owns the rights to it, that kind of thing. But you can find a free English version of the pattern online, and I have linked to that. So here's the back. It has the cute little heart button, and I really like how this turned out. It was not that fun to knit. I think that if I was going to knit it again, I would try to work up my own pattern, do it from the top down rather than from the bottom up, because there was just a lot of cutting of yarn and weaving ends in, where to me it seemed unnecessary to cut the yarn. With that, the pattern is not 100% clear. There are some parts where the numbers just don't add up, and it makes it a little bit tricky to knit if you don't know what you're trying to come up with. So, for example, like on these little stems here, they weren't coming out in the middle. So I knew that they needed to be in the middle, so I just changed how I was knitting them, but if you followed the instructions exactly, I don't know that they would necessarily come out in the middle. But it turned out as a cute little dress, and I think that they will like it. So I knit this out of the Yaku 416 in the 1041 colorway, and I'm really happy with the yarn and the dress. My other finished project this week is my Doris mittens, and I knit these mittens out of a wool and alpaca blend, and I knit it in curry and off-white. You can find the yarn in my show notes. But these turned out really well, and I'm really pleased with them. So the pattern is Doris by Clara Falk, and she's a Swedish designer. Here they are on. You can see maybe that they're like a little fuzzy. You see that? From the alpaca. And the thumbs are different. That's the part that I thought I wasn't going to finish. It took some personal motivation, like, you could only knit on your sock once you finish a thumb. But yeah, I'm really happy that they're done. I think they're going to be really nice to wear when I pull out my bike and start using that more, but it will still be pretty cold, especially in the evenings, so these will be really nice to have for some spring mittens. They're nice cheery colors and they'll be nice and warm. I did modify this pattern slightly. I added some extra stitches for the thumb gusset here because there's no way that it was going to fit my thumb, even though I had the correct row gauge and stitch gauge. So I just did another repeat section here, which meant that I added on some extra stitches, and I just kind of accommodated that. You can see sort of here how it decreases. For when I picked up the thumb stitches, I just did a couple rounds with the number I had and then quickly decreased down so that I had the same number of stitches as the thumb in the pattern. So like I said last week, if you are interested in knitting these mittens, but you don't speak Swedish, I think as long as you have some experience knitting colorwork, as well as maybe just mittens in general, but if you need to have a little bit of an idea of the construction, because it's not clearly laid out in the pattern, like step by step what you need to do. It's kind of like, here's the colorwork chart for the left mitten, figure it out, reverse it for the right mitten. It's not like step by step. Also, there is a number for you to cast on, and it says to cast on using an I-cord cast on, but it doesn't tell you how to do that. It says to refer to the techniques in the other part of the book. This pattern did come from a collection in a book called Mittens for All Seasons, or All Year Around, kind of. It's in Swedish, the title, but the patterns are available for individual purchase, so to me it's a little bit weird that they didn't include the techniques section also with each pattern, because it says refer to the techniques section, but it's not in the pattern. That's obviously in some other part of the book. But, I mean, I think the mittens are worth it. And it, you know, it's not that it's a poorly written pattern, it's just like not everything completely laid out, and especially if you are knitting it without knowing Swedish, maybe you're wondering, well, maybe it says it and I just don't know. But it doesn't really. You kind of just have to know. So, those are my finished projects this week. But some upcoming projects that I have been planning and working on this week is first of all, a new shawl design. And I have just finished, not really finished. I've almost finished charting out the shawl. I'll just show you this tiny little start that I have. It's almost nothing. But I just started that this morning after spending a lot of time yesterday trying to get the edging just right on this shawl, and there was a point after like 3 hours of working on it where it got to that point where I was so close to getting it that I knew that if I didn't figure it out, I wouldn't be able to sleep. So, got it. Today was a lot of charting, and I just started knitting it today, so that'll be fun to knit up and see that design come out. So I'm knitting the first sample just out of Knit Picks Stroll Fingering in the Dove Heather colorway. That is the yarn that I have in my stash with the most yardage, and Yeah, it's nothing special really, so I'm just trying kind of like the rough draft of the shawl on that. That's kind of part of the whole, I want to knit lacy things and lighter weight things as it's getting so nice and sunny outside and feeling a lot like spring. So next up we have the question and answer section for this week. And I will start out first with my questions for you. And I have 2 questions this week. One of them is a little bit more specific and particular, and the other one is one that I'm sure most people could answer. So my first question is, how do you like to knit hats? Do you knit hats on 16-inch needles, 16-inch circular needles, double-pointed needles, 40-inch circulars with magic loop, or 2 circulars? I tend to knit my hats on 40-inch circulars, and I do magic loop for them, but I would really like to knit them on a 16-inch or a smaller diameter needle where I don't have to do magic loop, so I can just go around and around. The problem for me is that I knit I knit holding my hands, holding the whole needle in my hand. And so when I'm knitting, I can't have the needle turn like this, which is what needs to happen for smaller diameter knitting. It really makes my hands cramp up, and I just feel like I can't make it happen. So if anybody has any suggestions for maybe it needs to be a shorter length needle, so like maybe only a 3-inch needle that can... I know what the problem is. The problem isn't so much that I use the whole needle, it's that I knit straight, like with my needles straight, pointing towards each other. And when you're knitting a hat, they're more like this. So maybe if I had a shorter needle, they could stay straight with still having the turn. So if anybody has that same problem or has had that same problem and come up with a solution, let me know. My second question this week is if anybody has ever been to or lives in Ireland, and if they have any recommendations for yarny or sheepy things to do in Ireland. I may possibly be taking a trip there in the near future, and I would love to know if you have any recommendations. So this week, for questions that people have asked, I'll be answering a couple questions, and the first one is from Nikki, and she's from New Zealand, and she asks why are you in Sweden? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Do you have a job, or are you a stay-at-home knitter? Do you plan to move back to the US? And do you use a knitting journal? So I moved to Sweden in December of 2013, and I live here with my Swedish boyfriend, Thomas. And I moved here after I had not gotten into nursing school in Colorado. And I was kind of ready for something else, some change, I guess. And I figured, why not? It seems like a good time to try something else out, move somewhere new, and so since I've moved here, I have been trying to learn Swedish, which is quite difficult, but I think I'm making progress, so I have been in school some of the time learning Swedish, and I am also a nanny and babysitter. So Thomas was in the U.S. as an au pair. He was taking care of some twin boys there, and then we moved here and kind of switched roles. So instead of me going to school and him as the nanny or au pair, I am now the nanny au pair, kind of. nanny. I don't live with them, I live here. And he is going to school. But we will see in just a couple of days now if I might also be going to school in the fall. So, yeah. Anyway, so that's why I'm in Sweden. Do I plan to move back to the US? I think probably eventually I will move back to the US. I know my parents will want me to say yes, I'm definitely coming back. Of course I will come back at some point. I don't know when it will be. It will all depend on school and jobs and that kind of thing. But as I'm getting into spring in Sweden again, I remember that it's nice to live here as it's lighter, longer during the day. But I could definitely see myself living somewhere else for the winters, because it's not so much that it's really cold, because it stays right around freezing in general for most of the winter, but it is so much darker. And even when it's daylight time, the sun is usually not out. So for me, that's been one of the harder adjustments to living here. But let's see. So I am definitely a stay-at-home knitter for a lot of time, but I do babysit several times during the week for a couple of families regularly. Let's see. Oh yeah, and do I use a knitting journal? So I showed this on, I think it was episode 1, and I used this knitting notebook, knitter's notebook from Chronicle Books, mostly for my design ideas. It has some graph paper and room for notes and lots of places for filling in, what needles and stuff that you use. So that's where I keep track of kind of the early stages of designing, and then also once I've sort of finalized a design, I kind of update it in there. Otherwise, I just use a lot of scraps of paper for designing. On my desk right now, there's 5 pieces of graph paper with various amounts of shawl pattern on them. And then I also use this notebook, which I think I may have also shown in episode 1 or 2. I use this notebook for my show notes. So when I'm recording an episode, I write down what I want to say in there so I can remember. And then I also do some sketches in here for designs. But I don't have a notebook with all my swatches in it. In general, I keep my swatches in that turquoise box that's up there. When I lived in Colorado, I kept some of my current swatches pinned to a bulletin board. But I don't have a bulletin board here. I do have a little string above my desk with clothespins on it. Sometimes I might clip some swatches to there, but mostly I have cards from like my family and friends on that. Yeah. So another question, Susie from Oregon asks for some tips on how to improve finishing. For example, weaving in ends, seaming together, etc. And I am definitely not an expert in finishing. I think that I've become more aware of it and how important it is recently. I know that some helpful websites that I've used is the Purl Bee, and there's a link in the show notes for that. I particularly like their whole section on weaving in ends because it shows you lots of different ways to weave in ends, so it's not very often that a pattern will tell you how to weave in your ends, and I think people in the beginning especially they just start out knitting, they kind of just, or I did anyway, just kept going in and out and in and out as many times as I could until I thought, okay, like there's no way this is going to come out. But I like the Purlby one because they show maybe 8 different ways that you can weave in ends, and they say really there's not a wrong way to weave them in, but maybe if you want to try one of their ways, then perhaps if you have to undo your woven in end, it won't be quite as difficult. And that's kind of a funny thing because I am always a little bit paranoid about my ends coming out, so I weave them in really well. But then a couple times when I've had to undo something after the ends are already woven in, I can't, it's like impossible to undo. So I know in my head that they're never going to come out, but I still think about it and I overcompensate weaving in ends. So yeah. The last question this week is from Kira in Oregon, and she asks about stash. Do you put a limit to your stash? Or she says she keeps her stash in one box because she lives in a pretty small house, and once there's no more room in that, then she can't get any more yarn until it's used up. And I would say that I have sort of a similar stash method, I guess. I do have a little bit of a stash. I have some boxes that I keep yarn in. I have 3 plastic boxes that are this big, maybe. And I had more of a stash when I lived at my parents' house in the US because I had more space. And now I just kind of took what was my favorite yarn with me and yarn that I really thought I would use, and now I don't acquire as much yarn because I'm much more aware, I think, of using, well, knowing that I really like to buy yarn, but also knowing that sometimes when I buy yarn it just sits in my stash for a while. I'm trying to go more towards only buying yarn when I know exactly what I'm going to use it for. But that doesn't always happen. Like this. But okay, this was at the Wool Festival. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about this because I looked up in my Fleece and Fiber source book what fin ull garn is, and it means fine wool yarn, but I wondered if that was a specific type of sheep or what, because it sounds like it could just be a general name for soft wool. But it turns out that the Swedish fine wool is a type of sheep, and it is a conservation breed. It's been a conservation breed since the 1930s, and the fleece consists of white, black, or brown fibers, crimpy and lustrous. It has good elasticity, and it's from 20 to 28 microns, so anywhere from a soft to kind of a medium soft wool, with 1 3/4 to 2.5 inch staple length. So I was surprised to see how short the staple length was, because I guess I just assumed that it was a long wool, because to me, when you have a really shiny or lustrous yarn, I think long wool. But maybe I'm just totally wrong on that. Anyway, this is a mix of fin ull and Gotland sheep, or wool, which is a sheep from Gotland, but also in a lot of other areas of Sweden now. And the other interesting thing is that the Swedish fine wool actually originated in Finland, but it's been here for hundreds, if not, hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's considered Swedish now. So, I think that is about it for this week. I would encourage you to go over to the Ravelry group, and in this week's episode thread you can answer the question about hats, how you knit your hats, or if you've ever been to Ireland and any woolly, sheepy, yarny things to do there. And I will just leave you with one final fun fact, which is, I don't know how I didn't know this. Maybe everyone knows this and I'm the only one who doesn't know it. But, you know, if you're knitting, especially if you're knitting, well, I don't know if especially, but sometimes when you're knitting lace, or if you're, okay, it could be anything, and you say that you have to tink back, like you have to undo your stitches one stitch by one stitch backwards because you messed up, right? So you tink back. Tink is knit spelled backwards. What? I had no idea. So, okay, tinking doesn't really work because it should be like tink, right? Because like ing should be at the beginning if it's knitting backwards. But you just take the knit, turn it to tink, and add ing. So, with that, I will leave you guys for this week, and I will talk to you next Tuesday. Bye!